Hello, everyone, both out there in the wide world of Facebook and here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. This program is being streamed in front of a live studio audience, so it's great to be with you all, both here at the museum and out there on the internet. It's always fun to do programs like this. Both in front of our virtual viewers and now in front of viewers in real life. So welcome everyone. For those of you that don't know, my name is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And we're thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Esco Elder. And we're going to be talking about her forthcoming book. It comes out just next week. It's called Love and Duty, Confederate Widows and the Emotional Politics of Loss. So all about how Confederate widows accrued and used political power in the years after the Civil War. So it should be a great time. And welcome, Esco. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with all of you.
And we already have folks tuning in. Diane from New Jersey tuning in online. We got folks in the room here all the way from Washington State. So this is truly a cross-country sort of affair. It's going to be a great time today. Before we jump in, of course, an easy way to support the museum is come visit us, as you all have done, or like us and follow us on social media, like the video, share the video. That's something easy that just about anyone can do. And if you really enjoyed today's program and you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. For as low as $25 a year, you support programming like this and all the sorts of things that we like to do and the important stories that we like to tell in our programming and such. See, we've got now more folks tuning in from New Orleans, Colorado, Michigan, Las Vegas. It's always fun to hear where people are tuning in from. So with all that said, we'll go ahead and jump in here. And Esco, I wonder if maybe you could start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to the field of Civil War history.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am currently in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I teach at Converse University, which is a small liberal arts college. So I teach a variety of American history classes, both inside the Civil War era and outside of it. And how I came to all of this is I'm someone who always loved stories. I can't get enough of the things that happened in the past, the good, the bad, the ugly, and especially the personal side of those stories, reading how people survived, endured different aspects of our nation's past. And so for a while, I thought I was headed into high school teaching. I did an undergrad degree in social studies education and was applying to both teach at the high school level and applying to grad schools, and was lucky enough to get into the University of Georgia, who offered me a teaching assistantship. And so I thought, well, I've got the momentum and some funding, let's go ahead and try that. And so I started the master's program there. And that's when I fell in love, not just with the teaching side of it, but also the research side of it. And so I was in a community history class with Dr. John Esco, who some of you may be familiar with, writes lots in the South. And anyway, so I was in this community studies class and I had to come up with a topic for a seminar paper, a 20-page paper, original research. And I had no idea. I mean, I was interested in all sorts of different things in the 19th century. And I went to the University of Georgia's archives, which at the time was in the library. Now it's in this big, beautiful facility. It was in the library before, and it fit your stereotypical archive experience to a T. It was dusty and kind of like the lighting wasn't great. And it was just magical, right? And so I go in there and I start pulling all of these collections that have to do with the Civil War, and especially women in the Civil War, because I thought maybe those would be stories I hadn't heard as much of at that time and would be interested in exploring, and stumbled across this collection between Will and Rosa Deloney, who was an Athens family, and he left to go and fight for the Confederacy. She had a few children at the time. She was pregnant with their fourth child, and they're writing these letters back and forth, and I'm reading these letters between them and was just struck by how emotional they were. They were beautiful writers. And then all of a sudden, I stumble across, like within all of these letters, a tiny slip of paper that's a telegram, and it's not even addressed to Rosa, it's addressed to her neighbors. And it says, that Will has been killed in action, and that on account of her condition, break the news to Rosa as best you can because she's pregnant. And I was just struck by this, that here I was holding this slip of paper 150 years later, right, that changed this woman's life, changed this family's life. And then I was struck by the fact that there was so much more that was in the box still waiting for me to read. And so I go through and I find out that Rosa does have this last baby. It's a little girl. And then Rosa becomes obsessed with trying to get her husband's body home, that she wants to bury it in Athens, Georgia, that she wants to have a place to mourn him, wants him to be in the family cemetery. Because he was an officer, she was able to discover where he had been buried, and able to have that transfer happen a few years after the Civil War. But then what I was even more struck by was that last child, the child that Will never got to meet, ends up dying of whooping cough. And so if you go to the cemetery today, here, and I have a picture of it, let me share my screen and I can show y'all. So here he is. This is one of his last letters home, where he's talking about his longing for home makes his army life almost insupportable, to give you a sense of the language there. And there's the telegraph, right? The thing that they were holding that changed her life. And then here's the cemetery today. And so you can go today in Athens and see where he is. And then he's next to this little girl. And there's this whole story here behind it, right? This is the daughter that he never met. And now they're side by side in the cemetery. And I was just struck by this. And so that started this whole journey into Confederate widowhood, and starting to uncover those stories. And then I became increasingly struck by this idea of, what is it like for these women, many of them 17, 18, 19 years old, they get married in this patriotic rush at the start of the Civil War. What is it like for them to not only lose their husbands in the war, but then to also lose the war afterwards, to have that double loss, and what happens next? And so that is the very long story of how I got into this project.
Gotcha. The stories like that, whenever you start writing a book, they're always a long and winding tale, and usually involving stumbling over something that you didn't expect to find, and things like that. That's why I always like to get those stories. And I should note too, by the way, both for our folks watching online and here in the room, if you have any questions during the program, don't hesitate to chime in. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Now, once you become intrigued by these questions and you want to set about writing something, where do you go first for sources? What sort of places, where do you look for these widows' papers, and how do you approach that?
Yep. So I started with letters and diaries. And the interesting thing for me about this project, or one of the challenges I should say, is that most finding aids didn't identify a woman as a widow necessarily. So I started with a lot of big family correspondences, and it almost got increasingly dark as I was reading through these, because I'd be reading through, papers potentially between two sisters, and waiting to see if one of their husbands was going to die, which is a terrible thing. But for my purposes, right, if he survived the war, then he wasn't going to fit into this story I was trying to put together, because I focused on women whose husbands died during the American Civil War, not afterwards. So a lot of letters and diaries within families, because I wanted both the widow's voice herself as much as I could get it, but also what their families were saying, what their communities were saying, what they were saying about widows within their community, and all of those relationships as well. I thought at first starting this that pension applications would be really valuable, but I found it to be more of a needle in a haystack, because so many pension applications would come in with someone whose husband had fought in the war, but then the husband passed away after the war, which wasn't the focus of my study. So I used them some if I knew that her husband had passed away during the war, but not as much as I thought. Newspapers were really valuable to especially get speeches and get what people were saying about widows in the community. And as I was working on this project, more and more got digitized, and that's such a rich resource for historians now, that so much of this is starting to go online, increasingly so. That wasn't there at the very beginning when I began this project, and has been really exciting. And then etiquette books, and that was probably my biggest surprise as far as something that I wasn't expecting to use it as a source. But I started exploring this idea of what was a widow supposed to do, what was she supposed to mourn like, and found that throughout the United States, there is this really strict etiquette in the 19th century that a widow is supposed to mourn for 2.5 years, that she's supposed to wear black, that her behavior, there's certain, she shouldn't be courting, she shouldn't be dancing. There are certain things that she is supposed to do and not supposed to do. And so I got really interested in this idea of, okay, well, this is what antebellum widowhood looked like. How does the Civil War change this or not? And what I found is that a lot of widows will cling to some aspects of mourning. When everything else is up in the air, that was something they could control. So even if they couldn't afford necessarily to buy black clothing, they could dye the only clothes they had black. And so that explains why so many widows, when I'm reading, are writing to their sisters and their mothers and saying, how do I procure this dye, or how can I change the fabric of this dress in order to meet that part of mourning. But then also look at the ways that mourning is changing and that mourning is different in the Civil War and especially in the Confederacy. And what I started to find there is that widows who mourned in the way that reinforced the Confederacy, in other words, widows that said, yes, my husband died for this cause, but it was worth it. It was worth the sacrifice. This cause is worth it. They were getting a lot more attention. They were getting this political capital that they were able to use in their communities to get things that they needed. And they knew this. They would actively use this. They would write to local officials and governors and say, I am a soldier's widow. I really need X, Y, and Z. But then I saw the flip side of that too, that the widows who said, no, enough is enough. Send home my father, send home my brothers, send home my male cousins. This war is not worth the sacrifice. That was a really powerful indictment against the Confederacy. And so again, these women who in many cases are extremely young, 18, 19, 20, 21, are getting all of this attention and all of this pressure to mourn in a particular way. And those that do are getting championed, and those that don't are getting scolded and commented upon, and all of these other complex political aspects that I was not expecting at all when I started this project. So.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I knew there was some degree of etiquette there, but just the sheer amount of rules that you kind of laid out, rules, fascinating. And, there's, I'm sure, a whole other book to be written, or perhaps has been written, about how those became solidified over time, and, how we got to the Civil War as well. But yeah, that's pretty incredible. Diane, watching online, asked an interesting question about how long did it take on average for the widows to be notified that their spouse or family member had passed away?
Yeah, that is a really important question. And a lot of it depends, right? So if the husband was an officer and if he died in an extremely public way, right, everybody saw him go down, then it could be pretty immediate that she could get a telegraph. If her husband was of lower rank, if he perhaps was captured and then passes away in a prison later on, or if he is wounded on the field and left without any identifying, a letter or something that says who he is, then it might take months for her to find out, or she might never find out. And so I did find, when I was reading, some widows would write things like, they're so grateful that he died in clothing that they knew, right? So like a lot of times those pieces of clothing or a lock of hair would be mailed back home to the family, so that they felt like they had proof. Some widows are, not surprisingly, traumatized by all of this. And so if they were able to travel to where they had last heard their husband was, if they had the money and the means, or depending on the location, sometimes they would show up at the hospital looking for their husband. And I found several instances of women who refused to believe it until the body was physically dug up. Didn't matter if it had been, a few weeks. They wanted to see his face, to have that concrete proof that he had actually passed away. Some soldiers, and Drew Gilpin Faust, she wrote this fabulous book, which I've pulled, This Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War. It's such a fantastic, you can see how well worn my copy is. Fantastic study, great foundation for a lot of what I did. She talks a lot about the networks that soldiers would form with one another. So, sometimes widows would get letters and they dread this, getting a letter in unfamiliar handwriting, right? And again, sometimes it's a week after, but sometimes it might be a month after, from someone who fought alongside her husband, who shared the news that he had passed away or that likely had passed away or been wounded. And this was the last time that he had saw them. So kind of these informal networks that would get spread out, because soldiers realize in the chaos of war sometimes, and especially if you had to leave the field, if you had to leave people on the field who were then captured by the other side, that the news didn't always happen and wasn't necessarily as predictable as people would like. And so, but there are also stories too, right, of women whose husbands stop writing, and so they fear the worst. It's been a month or two, and then suddenly the mail starts again, and suddenly they get that letter again. And so you have these letters of relief that the person has survived. So long way to say it depends. Sometimes it could be within a few days, and sometimes it could be weeks or months. I would say standard is at least a week or two before they would find out.
Mhm. And I think that's important for us to remember, especially in the age of the internet, with the immediacy that allows us, that, especially towards the longer end of that spectrum, a month plus, it staggers our minds to even comprehend that. But, this sort of, it makes sense, with that the mourning process might take so long, because it might take upwards of a month or more to even find out that someone's dead in the first place. So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense when you put it in that context. Now, I know one of the things that you consulted for your book, you did a lot of material culture work, specifically with mourning gowns. And I wondered if you could maybe share with us, some of the things you were looking for, and what that was like to kind of take a physically look at these, in person, and how all that went.
Right, absolutely. So for me, the physical sides of this, it was really helpful for me to write and to understand what the people were writing about from the time period, right? So they can talk about their clothing all day long in a letter, but for me as a writer, to stand before a mourning gown, to see how long the veil was, to see how heavy the fabric was really powerful. And then to imagine what it would have been like in a community to see someone wearing that garment every single day, and the way that it physically would separate her from her community. There was no way to miss the fact that she was in mourning, that she was a widow, and it labeled her and gave her community directions just right off the site of how she should be interacted with. And this was a woman who had lost, who had sacrificed something. And so that was just valuable for me to start wrapping my head around why women mourns the way they did. And if we think about even today, what we wear and in the environment outside, it affects how we feel. And so there's that interaction, that interplay too, between the material culture and the emotional side of things. And even things like hair jewelry, which was extremely popular in the 19th century, to take a lock of someone's hair, their loved one's hair, and to braid it and to wear it, and to see those in some of the museums and historic sites that still have them on display today. In the way, again, that mourning in the 19th century in some cases was very physical, which is in part why the Civil War was so traumatic, right? Most 19th century Americans expected that their loved one would die at home in their bed, surrounded by their loved ones. It'd be peaceful. They'd get a chance to have those final words. And the Civil War is terrifying for both the Union and the Confederacy, because now all of a sudden that is gone. Your loved one is dying far away. It might be traumatic. There might not be those last words. You might not, again, even know that your loved one has passed away. And so because families and widows couldn't control any of that, they almost doubled down on mourning. What could they control? Well, that was something, the mourning clothing, the gowns was something they could control. And so I was really interested in looking at them physically, and then using that to better, hopefully make the writing a little bit better at explaining what it would have been like. Here I can show, I have some pictures of that too. Let me share my screen again. May not be in order. I just threw a bunch of different pictures together because I was like, I don't know what I'll need. So here you can see, right, some of the buildings even would be draped to signify that this was a place of mourning, or this was a place that had lost something. And then here are some pictures, right, so of the mourning. And again, this varies depending on finances, especially as the war goes on, especially as the blockade becomes more and more effective on the Confederacy, and how much money a widow had, whether she actually purchases purchases these things, or if she's making them herself, or dyeing her clothing herself. And again, not all widows would do this, but I did find, even from lower class widows, to the extent the source base would let me get to it, that a lot of widows are wanting and attempting to dye clothing black. Here's your famous, right? When everyone thinks of Confederate widows, they think of Scarlett O'Hara. So you can see kind of the mourning clothing in action, at least the Hollywood version of it there. And then, oh, there's one more picture. Hold on, let me pull it right at the back. So here, right, many people, if you have spent some time going through Civil War museums or read, have perhaps seen this picture of Richmond, Virginia, and focused on the ruin. But what I find is interesting, right, for my cases, is the figures in the bottom corner here that are women in mourning. And so another example of what that would have looked like. So,
and especially mourning in direct relation to a physical representation of the Confederacy, right?
mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
You just kind of touched on this a little bit, but a couple questions from the comments. Suzanne, one's fairly granular and one is a bit broader. So Suzanne wondered what dye specifically was used to color clothes black. And then Cam asked, in your book, did you have the opportunity to see how different classes mourned? I know you just kind of touched on that.
Yeah,
so could you
bit.
speak to either of those?
Yes. So I think the question about what dyes specifically, I cannot speak to off the top of my head. It's a great question. And I would have to go back to the letters to see which materials they were talking about, for sure. As far as different classes, so I was expecting to see, how should I was expecting, like when I went into this, I had these preconceived notions about very different mourning between various classes. And I didn't find that as much as I thought. Certainly the finances affected what mourning could look like for women. So elite women were more likely to be able to buy expensive mourning clothing. Elite women didn't have to jump into the workforce, obviously, if they had family support that would financially provide for them, or if their husband had left money, elite women could perform that role. Lower class women, in some cases, did have to jump, they couldn't just mourn for 2.5 years. They would have to find work immediately. They would have to be providing for their children if they didn't have any sort of financial support. So that part of it definitely depended. I found this one story, which I still wrestle with, and I'm not quite sure what to do with, about 2 women who were arrested for prostitution in Washington, D.C. And they say that the only reason they did this was because they were widows, that their husbands had died at Gettysburg, and that's why they turned to the oldest occupation, and ultimately are released and set free because of this. Were they actually widows or not? Were they just saying they were widows to get out? I mean, we'll never probably know. But it is fascinating. It does hint to that part of the class experience. But as far as the act of mourning and grieving, it hits lower class women, middle class women, upper class women similarly in a lot of ways. As far as those that were really close with their husbands do endure a lot of grief and a lot of trauma and a lot of struggle to try to figure out how do they navigate this new life that they wouldn't have expected, being in their 20s or 30s, not expecting to be widowed so young. A lot of them are pregnant at the time of their pregnancy. Now, granted, there are some terrible husbands out there. I did find a handful of examples of widows who are quietly celebrating the loss of someone who they could not divorce in that time and era. But that's more of the exception, or at least they aren't writing about it in a way that I could find in the sources. That's more of the exception than the rule. And so lower class women are seeming to dress in black and dress in mourning. They are using that position to try to get the things they need. So after the Civil War, writing, I am a widow, I lost my husband at such and such, and I have these teaching skills and I'm looking for a job.
You cut out there.
Oh,
Angela.
sorry. Can you hear
still
me?
Hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hold on, let me try this.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Okay, there we are.
Okay.
All right, yeah, we're good.
Great. Okay. I was just saying, one thing after the Civil War, in the newspapers, lower class widows would use their status to try to get the support they needed. So writing into the newspapers, I'm a widow, I lost my husband at such and such, and therefore I'm taking in boarders, or I'm taking in, I'm opening up my house, or I'm looking for a teaching position, or I'm having this fundraiser. And so lower class widows are definitely aware of this political status that they've gained, and they're trying to use it to their ability after the war.
Gotcha. So the way in which they mourn is similar across class lines, but it's sort of impacted, by their personal wealth and the way that they kind of react to this loss can vary.
Yeah.
Now let's talk a bit about the title of your book, Love and Duty. Obviously, I think both of those words are pretty key for your, the points you're trying to make in the book. I wonder if maybe you could just speak a little bit about the primacy of both love and duty as it relates to your project.
Absolutely. So that of course has a long story behind it too. When I early stages of this project, when it was a dissertation, it was titled Married to the Confederacy. And I had 6 chapters, which I had paired off to have and to hold, for better and worse, till death do us part, right? So I had this whole framework that I loved, and then revised and did all of this work on it. So when UNC Press and I were talking about the title, we said, really, it can't be Married to the Confederacy anymore, because we have so much more that we've changed. And so we went back and forth about the titles, probably for weeks, just, me and the editors trying to come up with the best way to capture this. And it ended up coming from this poem, which I have here. I'll have to flip back. Hold on a second. At the beginning. Okay, can y'all see that?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so this is printed in the front of the book too. So the title Love and Duty is pulled from this poem, Heart Victories, written by a soldier's wife, which was published in the Southern Poems of War by Miss Emily Mason in 1867. It's this whole collection of poems. And the whole thing is fantastic, which is why I begged and UNC Press let me put it in the front of the book. But that second stanza, their love, the true, the brave, the beautiful, the strong, wrestles with duty, gaunt and stern, wrestles and struggles long. He falls no more again, his giant foe to meet, bleeding at every opening vein, love falls at duty's feet. And so that was the image that I was trying to capture, and that this project really wrestles with, is this idea, this tension between love and duty. And from the Confederacy's perspective, this is what they want. They want love to fall at duty's feet. They want Confederate widows to reinvest themselves in the Confederacy, and to speak well of it, and to give speeches and do all of these things to build it up. But not all widows are able and willing to do that, right? That doesn't account for the diversity of the experiences and the personalities, and those who say no, and that they don't want their love to fall at duty's feet. And so the poem kind of goes on from there, and it talks, and this is on that second part of the slide, where it says, while she, the tried, the true, the loving wife of years, chokes down the rising agony, drives back the starting tears, I yield thee up, she cries, in the country's cause to fight, right? So like this idea that they will give up the men in their lives as soldiers. And so that's where the title comes from. And so I'm happy that we got to use it and got to put the poem in the beginning to set the stage for the variety of stories to come.
Absolutely. That's a pretty moving poem, pretty weighty and intense. That's a great find, and certainly lends itself, of course, to this sort of project. So I'm glad it worked out the way that it did. So
Me too.
A couple questions from the comments that will sort of work their way together with my next question. So Debbie asked, well, and I know you said that, this whole mourning period is sort of a 2.5-year arc of sorts. But Debbie asked, did many remarry as soon as they could to help in financial support, especially if they had children? And not many, and there's not a ton of employment opportunities for women. So what did that process look like? And There was another kind of how often did upper class women, widows, become poor women due to loss of property, homes, farms, etc.? So yeah, maybe talk a bit about
Yeah.
what that process was like.
Absolutely. Oh, I love those questions. Thank you. So upper class widows were more likely not to remarry. They were more likely to choose widowhood, to live as widows. Some of them were Black for the rest of their days, and they'll almost make a career out of their widowhood. And so a famous example of this would be Emily Todd Helm. So Emily is the little sister of Mary Todd Lincoln. So the Todd family, Lincoln's in-laws, is huge, 8 or 9 siblings, I think. Half of them support the Confederacy, half of them support the Union. So when Abraham Lincoln talks about this being a war of brother versus brother, he's literally thinking of his in-laws. He's thinking of Mary's siblings who are split in this war. And so Emily, who Abraham Lincoln calls little sister, really affectionate, like before the war, they were close. There's this great story that Emily tells when she first met Abraham Lincoln. And she's a good bit younger than her sister. She thought he was a giant. She expected him to say fee, fi, fo, fum, and she hid in her mother's skirts until Abraham Lincoln pulls her out and says, so this is little sister. And he calls her little sister his whole life, and actually tries to get her husband to be in the U.S. Army, continue on to be in the Union. He says no, he's from Kentucky. He goes to the Confederacy. Ultimately, he is killed during the Civil War when they are down in Georgia. And it's a long and convoluted story, but Emily actually ends up in the White House for a little bit. So here we have a Confederate widow in the White House mourning with her sister Mary, who had just lost their son. And Abraham Lincoln's getting all of this criticism for having a Confederate widow in the White House during the war. And she gets into a verbal spar with several people, as the Todds do. They all have a really sharp tongue, and ultimately she leaves. And so, very long story short, Emily is an example of a wealthy upper class woman who never remarries. She is going to be the wife of General Helm her whole life. She's going to give speeches at veterans reunions. She's going to write letters. She's going to help draft the history. She's going to be a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and all of these different groups, Ladies Memorial Association, all of these groups. And so she is the widow, right? She gets a lot of social status from being it because she doesn't need the money. Lower class women are more likely to remarry. If they can, they'll wait the 2.5 years, but again, not always. And as the war goes on and many women notice that their opportunities for getting married are becoming less and less, some widows will get married during that 2.5 year mourning period. And it's scandalous in many cases, even among the lower class, because there are these things you're supposed to do. Your husband isn't supposed to be someone you can easily replace. But widows are caught in this position when the opportunity arises. Some of them take it. And so there was this one collection I found where the widow is instructing the man that she's courting to disguise his handwriting so that her family doesn't realize that the letters coming in are from this man, this suitor. She wants her family to think it's from one of her female friends. And they do ultimately marry before this 2.5 years is up. There's another story of a woman from Georgia who remarries her late husband's business partner. And she's getting all of these letters describing the death of her husband. And it's still from her first husband because they don't realize that she has remarried. And apparently she was quite the flirt, because her sister is complaining that after she leaves home and marries this second husband, that all of her other suitors are still just harassing her and bothering her and asking for news about her sister, to the point that at one point the sister cuts a piece of hair from an oxen tail and perfumes it and gives it to one of the suitors to play this trick. And the two sisters are giggling about this. And she said that the suitor pulls the hair and like kissed it and like puts it back in his pocket secretly. And the sister just thinks this is the funniest thing, right? But again, it just shows how complicated this time is. But for lower class women, if the opportunity arose, they were more likely, not always, but more likely to marry before that 2.5 years was up, to mixed results. Some people saying that they wish their sister had been more dignified or that they had mourned longer. And some of them seem to have an understanding of why their family member chose to do this. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a fascinating dance. And that one that's more complicated, I guess, than I realized, that these people have to navigate here.
Mm-hmm.
So getting to the whole idea of political power and how this ties into widowhood, of course, women couldn't vote in the 19th century, but it's been well documented that they're certainly very politically aware, of course, and exerted political influence. And so how were these Confederate widows in this unique situation to wield that influence, and what did they do with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Confederate widows have a very special relationship, I think, with the Confederacy as a political entity because mothers who lose their sons, of course, that is heartbreaking. But as society understands it, they still have a protector, they still have a husband, or they still have other sons potentially. But for a widow, when she loses her husband, then all of the sudden she is this thing that's attracting attention. She had this special relationship to her husband, and then by extension to the Confederacy. And so we see people, even Jefferson Davis, giving speeches, making this connection between if a soldier passes away in the service of the Confederacy, then it's that community's responsibility to take care of the widow, right? That he wouldn't have given his life if he had not known that his widow would not be taken care of. And widows, many of them recognize this. And so they'll write letters in uncharacteristically political ways to local governments, to state governments, asking for support. They'll often sign paperwork, so and so a Confederate widow, kind of reminding people within their circle and outside their circle what they've sacrificed to try to make sure that they are surviving. And most of this seems to be happening on the individual level. And then after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War, I was fascinated to find that there is some pushback against some of the memorialization that's happening. So some of the monuments that are being put up, some people are saying, no, we need to be putting this money to Confederate widows who are destitute. We need to be putting this money into the home for widows and orphans. And in the 19th century, an orphan, by definition, is someone who has lost a father. So even if their mother is still living, when Abraham Lincoln talks about widows and orphans, he's referring also to the children who have lost their fathers, but their mothers are still alive. So the children of widows. And so there are people in the community who are saying that it is their obligation. It is their obligation to take care of widows, and some widows themselves who are saying, because I have sacrificed politically and personally, therefore I have this special relationship and I am owed, this job, this food, this status. And then some too are going to take advantage of this and go on to give speeches and to do things at reunions, veterans reunions, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, so demanding some sort of obligation from local bodies and perhaps even larger than that, even state-sized bodies as well, where there individuals or groups of widows that would write to state governments to demand this sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. There definitely were, talking about how, especially if the more desperate or the less support they have from their family or potentially their local community, the more likely they would take that status and say, my children are starving, or I really, I need help, I need support. My husband died for this war. And so I feel like you as a government, you as a state should give me something. And it's important to note too, right? So for Confederate widows in particular, Union widows, they lose their husbands, but they win the war and pensions are going to kick in immediately. For Confederate widows, that doesn't happen. They're not going to be awarded U.S. pensions immediately after the Civil War. And so they definitely have to use that local support, the family support, and the community and the state in order to get some of those resources that other widows have access to.
Yeah, well, and we had talked about class earlier. I imagine that sort of financial support and obligation is especially important to those who are, hurting for money a little bit.
Yeah, and sad stories would get posted. There was one story, I was so upset when I read it, in a newspaper that was about a widow who was at work and she had two little boys, and her two little boys were washing in the river. And then long story short, they drowned, right? And it's this whole long story about finding the bodies and all of this. And when I read it, the way it's written, I was so upset and mad. I was like, I'm not putting this in my book. Like, this book is dark enough. I don't want to use it. And then, of course, a couple days later, I was like, no, this story really highlights the position that some widows are in after the war, and why there's so much fascination with them, and why there is this call for support. And then I couldn't find it again. It was in an online database. I spent probably another 2 days trying to find the one source I'd already found that I said I wasn't going to use, but then needed to use. So anyone who's writing out there, save everything, even if you think you're not going to use it, which I should have learned that lesson by then, but I learned it again at that moment. Anyway, so I find this story and I use it in my Reconstruction chapter again as an example of some of the hardships, right? Many people across the South are struggling after the Civil War, but especially people who have lost, someone who's supposed to be the sole support, financially. Widows are really struggling, and these stories show up in the newspapers about their struggles and then are used in ways to try to get additional things that they need to survive.
And I'm glad you, by the way, glad you briefly mentioned the contrast with Union widows. Karen in the comments asked a very similar question. There are some key differences, of course. The federal pensions are available to them, more or less right away, at least as soon as they can apply and get them, which is no small feat in of itself, of course. But the pensions are available. They don't have to deal with, as you put it, the double loss of also having lost the war and things like that. So there's important differences that way, obviously. But in terms of the actual kind of rituals of mourning, the 2.5 year time frame and whatever else, was that more like an American cultural thing, or did that vary north and south?
No, that was an American cultural thing. So it is something that unites. There are lots of similarities in that experience, right? Definitely the mourning for 2.5 years. There was a lot of encouragement for widows to be religious, to find comfort in heaven, and within their churches. There was a lot of focus for both the Union and the Confederacy for widows to devote themselves to their children, that the children are the direct relation to the husband that they've lost. And so motherhood becomes increasingly glorified, and leads to some really interesting tensions too between widows and their mothers-in-law if they had just been recently married, right? So for a mother who is mourning a son who was supposed to outlive her, it's a little bit different if he had been married for quite some time. But if he had gotten married in this patriotic rush at the start of the war, in some cases, the mothers felt like they knew their sons a lot more than the wife they'd only had for 6 months, for a year. And especially if that woman was pregnant and has a child who looks just like her son that she's lost. And there's some interesting tensions between mothers-in-law and widows as they're trying to navigate all of this. Sometimes it's a great system of support, as you can imagine, and sometimes it is not a system of support. It's a huge source of tension for both widows and for mothers-in-law who are grieving the loss of their sons. That I would say is similar across both the North and the South. And I almost wondered too, if as the war went on for both the Union and Confederacy, if people became more accepting of this loss, right, as the death tolls are rising and they're experiencing so much grief as a society. And what I found was no, because for each woman, that was her husband who died. And that was the first time she had lost a husband. So that immediate grief, that emotion, all of the anger, all of the different things that could get wrapped up in this process, it stays. It doesn't matter if it's in 1861 or if it's in 1865. That's the first time she's experienced this. And again, across the Union and the Confederacy, you see this, that it's not like it gets any easier, because for her, that was the first time. So yes, that comment is exactly right. There definitely are some similarities, that this is an American experience in many ways as they're wrestling the war and the aftermath of it.
Got it. Now, you mentioned with Confederate widows, this sort of wielding of political influence starts on an individual level, but did it expand to a group level? I'm thinking specifically of like ladies' memorial associations that pop up across the South. Were there examples of that where they collectivized it a little bit?
Mm-hmm. So this is something that I would love for someone to do more research on, because I have one chapter on Reconstruction. Most of my book is from the war itself. But in that one chapter, I expected to see more widows involved in the ladies' memorial associations and some of these projects. And from the sampling that I didn't see it. In fact, most of the people who are in leadership, with a few exceptions, right? Most of the people in leadership are women who still have their families intact. And so I almost wonder if those communities and those families felt like they had something to prove. A widow doesn't have to prove. She, by definition, has sacrificed for the Confederacy. She already has someone to mourn. She already has a grave or a date or, a process here. But for women whose families remained intact, where everybody came home, it seems like they were more involved. Potentially they had more ability to do so because they had more financial support, but they seemed like they were more involved in ladies' memorial associations. And so for the rosters that I did go through, I did not find as many widows as I thought I was going to find. It seems like many of the ones who are involved in that were either younger and then coming of age, right? So they weren't necessarily married during the Civil War, or there were families who, again, their loved ones came home. And so they're the ones who are decorating the graves and doing the fundraising and some of those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and a great point that, sometimes you expect to find something and you get in there and you get into the sources and, you just don't quite find what you're looking for. So love that. Now, when I was putting together my kind of list of questions and such for you, and I was thinking about, your book, it calls to mind, among others, two books in particular. One that we've already mentioned, Drew Gilpin Faust's This Republic of Suffering, which is all about just how the nature of death changes and how people interact with death in the United States, and Caroline Janey's Burying the Dead but Not the Past, which is all about the memory of death in the Confederate States. And I wondered if you could speak to very specifically, how your book kind of builds on and kind of fits in with those books, or anything else that was really influential for you as you're putting this together.
Absolutely. So I feel very lucky that I had such a strong foundation to build this study on. Drew Gilpin Faust, especially her book and her work on death, and even her earlier book, Mothers of Invention, on women in the South, were invaluable to me. And I love her writing style too, the way she weaves in stories and has so many examples. And so that definitely was foundational. Yeah, Janie's book too, on just one of those books that I read as a graduate student, and you just highlight almost everything, right? It just spoke to me in such a way, mostly because it wasn't until graduate school that I got to read more deeply and especially get introduced to all of these scholars who are doing so much gender history. I also think of Leanne Whites, for example. I mean, there's so many great folks out there. And so reading as widely as I could really helped me just to get exposed to the kinds of sources that historians use and get exposed to the kinds of stories that historians can tell. And especially those stories where it seems like, well, why hasn't this been told? Like, how can we find these sources? Stephanie McCurry too, her book, and I pulled that to throw in my pile here, Confederate Reckoning. That was something that was really foundational and helpful for me when I was working on this project, just the way that she talks about how the Confederacy becomes answerable to enslaved people and answerable to women in the way. And a lot of those ideas about politics were inspired by this book, and then building it and looking specifically at widows. And then another one, pull it. If we're looking at emotions history and grief, especially, Diane Miller Somerville has a great work that just has come out recently, but then also this one, Moments of Despair, Suicide, Divorce, and Debt. And this is in Civil War, North Carolina, by David Silkenet. People who are looking at these moments, right? I mean, we'll never know exactly what people were feeling, but we can study how they express it. We can study the emotion as they are saying it, as they are writing it, and then the way that emotion is used in all sorts of ways across the nation, and especially during the Civil War. So those are some of the books that inspired me as I was working on this project.
Gotcha. Well, as we're coming towards the end here, are there any kind of points that you really highlight in the book that we haven't had a chance to get to?
Oh goodness. So
I know that's a huge open-ended question for the author of a
yeah,
book to try and tackle all that, but anything, I want to make sure you get the chance to highlight what you
sure.
want.
Yeah. So the book, the book starts, okay, how do I put it in a nutshell, right? The book starts in the antebellum South. And so I spend some time talking about what it is that marriage looked like, what people expected it to look like, what etiquette looked like, what reality of death looked like, what widowhood looked like, kind of before the war comes and just tears everything apart. Most of the book is in the war itself. And then again, as I mentioned, I have that little bit on Reconstruction, which I'm hoping someone's going to follow behind me and add even more because there's a huge story there. And so I think what's missing the most from what we just talked about is the stories in the book. I mean, I was able to go to archives across the South and so pull all of these different stories. And that's what I really just tried to highlight is lots and lots of stories, happy ones, sad ones, heartbreaking ones that are just unbelievably frustrating. And so that's something that folks could expect to find in the book. Like there's this one woman in Florida that I spent a good amount of time writing on about her courtship, which takes place before the Civil War, about her marriage, and then her widowhood is especially tough because she's one of those widows who never becomes reconciled, who never says this cause was worth it. And she has this diary entry that she writes, and I included the entire thing in the book because it was so powerful and I couldn't say it in any better way, where she talks about how within 1 week, she's pregnant. Within 1 week, she finds out her husband has passed away at war. Her mother dies, and she gives birth to a little boy prematurely. And she names the little boy Winston after her late husband, but cannot bring herself to call him that name. She calls him Winnie throughout his entire life. And her sister is just horrified. She said, Winnie is an ugly name. Winnie is a girl's name. You need to call him by the man, by the name that you have named him after. And this widow is like, I can't. She writes in her diary about she spends all these mornings going through old journals and scrapbooks and just mourning and mourning about how this was not how she wanted her life to be. And so we've gotten some of those stories out there in our talk, but that's more what's in the book. Here, let me show my plug really quick. If anyone, I think it's, hold on, it's the beginning or the here. Okay. If anyone is wanting to get this book or any of the other books at UNC Press, they do have this great deal going on right now, which is on their website. I wanted to highlight here. As you can see, it's 01DAH40, where their books are 40% off. And I think if you spend a certain amount, you get free shipping too. So if you need more history in your life or Mother's Day or Father's Day presents or those kinds of things, this is one of the best sales I've seen them run in a while. I stocked up on a lot of my favorites and new things coming out. So I wanted to make sure I shared that with y'all.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's definitely a winner and a great deal. And if anyone is furiously going to write it down, never fear, after the live broadcast is over, you can go back and watch the video and pause it there so you can take as long as you need to write it down. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Angela. And thank you for sharing some of those stories. I mean, thank you for highlighting those. As you mentioned, I think at the very beginning, that your true love of history, came from storytelling, which is something that motivates us here a lot at the museum as well, telling those individual stories, because it really kind of adds that character and texture to history that you just kind of don't get otherwise. So that was great. And I wondered if maybe you could close us. I have just immense respect for anyone who can write an entire book. It's you don't need me to tell you it's a gargantuan achievement, and you put so much of yourself into it, and pretty soon it'll be out there in the world and people will respond to it however they will. But I wonder if you would tell us what your hope is for the book.
Goodness. I don't know. You're right. It is a terrifying thing. And I alternate between being incredibly excited and then thinking, oh my goodness, like, was it ready? Like, should I have done this, that, or more, done more research? And, when I started this, I'm a very different historian than I am now, as we all grow and evolve. But I have 3 little kids, and they are done with mommy working on the book. They're ready for mommy to work on the next book, and preferably take them to some cool places for research along the way. I think my hope my hope is that people will build on it. Honestly, as I mentioned, there's so many fantastic scholars in emotions history and gender history that I was inspired by, stories that I never heard when I was in middle school or high school. It wasn't until I was lucky enough to go to college that I found out, for me especially, that war is so much more. Military history, I have a tremendous respect for it, but all of this gender history, all of the experiences of women, of people of color, of all of these other stories that I just couldn't get enough of and reading enough of. And there's so many great scholars working on it. So my hope is that that people enjoy it, they enjoy the book, and that people continue to use it to build on and add these stories and add to these stories and do more research. So
awesome. And it doesn't get better than that. Hoping for something like that if you're a historian. So that's, I think, a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and all of our other videos, go ahead and hit the like button, share it, follow us across all social medias to stay up to date with all the programs that we're working on. And we really appreciate folks tuning in. If you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Your membership dollars support programming like this, and we really appreciate those of you who've joined to this point, and look forward to having folks come and visiting us here at the museum. So thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. And thank you, Angela, for joining us today.
yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for all the fantastic questions.
Fantastic. All right. Well, until next time, this is John and Angela signing off.